Welcome back to our second part of our notes on South and Southeast Asia in the post-classical world. So the last notes we had in part one, we talked about the spread of Islam into the northern part of South Asia. So in this set of notes in part two, we're going to look at South Asia or southern India, and we're also going to look at the spread of Islam and Buddhism into Southeast Asia. So let's start with southern India. Southern India, unlike northern India, is never going to be centralized until the British come along and do it way in the future. And so they have a long history of decentralization. The Mauryan and the Gupta dynasty did not get down here, and neither will the Sultanate of Delhi. And so it's a very easy continuity that we see in South Asia. It's going to be controlled by small regional kingdoms known as Rajas, and they don't experience as much direct interaction with Muslims as northern India does. One, because they're not conquered by Muslims like they were in northern India. And two, is a lot of the major ports are going to be in the northern part of South Asia. And so they're not going to have as much direct trade, as the people in northern India with Muslim merchants. Because of that, southern India is going to remain primarily Hindu. Even today, we see that South Asia is divided among Hindus and Muslims in the north, but in the south, it's almost all Hindu. Now, however, we will see, though, that there is some interaction with Muslims, and we do see development of devotional cults in South India. As we had talked about in our last set of notes, that devotional cults, they like some aspects of Islam, and they take that into Hinduism and adopt it, whether it's the idea of immediate salvation in one life, which is appealing to the poor, or being devoted to one particular god, or the idea that all of the Hindu gods are really just reincarnations of the same god. All of these ideas are starting to percolate through the Hindu population, even in southern India. Next, since southern India doesn't have one large-scale empire to unite everybody and to promote trade, we see that somebody has to fill that gap. And in southern India, it is the temples, the Hindu temples that we find in the region. The warrior kings are busy fighting each other or whatever, but we see that the temples, they're going to be something that is going to have enough power and enough influence among the people to help organize the peasants into labor systems. And that may mean clearing swamps. It may mean cutting down forests to open up more farmland, and so we see food production go up at this time. That also mean building reservoirs and dams to hold water from the rainy season so that we have that water in the dry season. And so we see that these temple complexes are going to offer some structure, enough structure to promote economic development. This is very similar to what we saw in Western Europe during the same period, the medieval period, where it was decentralized, and the local church or monastery did much the same thing, organizing peasants to help increase agricultural production. Next, we're going to see that since Muslims do not move this far south, we don't see that the government creating madrasas to help young men learn to read and write, but temples, once again, will fill that void, and they will open up schools that will help the merchants' sons, as trade becomes more and more important, learn how to read and write and interact with the surrounding civilizations. They also serve as bankers. We have seen this in many instances in different places, like in ancient Greek with the Greek city-states, that the temple would serve as a storehouse for wealth. Here we see it also that the temples, they have quite a bit of wealth because they will help organize the peasants, and the peasants will donate money to the temple and to the Brahmin priest. But we also see that since they have this money, if you wanted to start up a new business, build a new boat, whatever, you could go to the richest thing in town, which was the temple, and you could ask for a loan. And the temple would then loan it to you with interest, and the temple would work as a bank, as a financial institution at this time in South Asia. So that is it for South Asia. Let's now move on to Southeast Asia. The peninsula that is between South Asia and East Asia. Today we see Thailand or Burma, Singapore, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that part of the world. And so this is the first time we've talked about this region in this class. Let's go all the way back to period 2, the beginnings of period 2. We see that the people who lived in South Asia were farmers. They grew primarily rice, and they lived in small farming villages. So there was much like India, no strong centralized rule. Very few kingdoms that were large enough that they can control a big area of Southeast Asia. So small, unorganized, kind of a tribal existence. But then in period 2, we see that merchants will learn how to use the monsoon winds, and they'll start to go across the Indian Ocean from India to Southeast Asia. And as they come in, they land along the coast, and the tribal chief who's along the coast, he starts to interact with these people from India, and they tell him about kingdoms. And we have these local people called Rajas, and they have control of not just one village, but many villages. And so the concept of kingship will make its way into Southeast Asia through merchants from South Asia. And so again, an example of cultural diffusion. Not only does the idea come from these merchants, but also the capacity to fulfill that idea. And so we have these 3 villages here, and they may be warring, they may be trading, but then when the Hindu merchants come in from South Asia and introduce the concept of kingdoms, not only do they introduce the idea, but they also introduce trade goods. And so this village on the coast is able to act as the middleman between villages further inland and the Hindu merchants on the coast. And so he's able to tax that trade and become very wealthy. And now that trade allows him to make money to build an army. And since he's got the idea of kingdoms now, he's able to use that army to go and conquer the surrounding villages and create the kingdom that the Hindus had told him that they have back in India. And so so we see that this trade with India is changing the political landscape as well as the economic landscape of Southeast Asia. Of course, not only do trade goods and ideas spread, but so do religions. And so we see at this time that the 2 religions of South Asia are going to make their way to Southeast Asia, Hinduism and Buddhism. Both are going to be brought by merchants, but certainly Buddhism is going to be brought by Buddhist monks and missionaries that are coming east, either on the Silk Roads for the north or then filtering down into Southeast Asia and bringing the idea of these 2 faiths into the region, replacing, for the most part, animism. Obviously, the first people to convert, like we've talked about in another set of notes, are going to be, certainly with Hinduism, are going to be the elite. The elite realize that if I stop being animistic and I start being Hindu, maybe this Hindu merchant will trade with me over some other village or some other person. And so we see the elite and merchants convert first, like we saw elites and merchants convert first in other places to other religions. Next, we see that part of the reason is that these elite will embrace Hinduism, certainly, is because Hinduism says they're okay with a caste system and they're okay with elites having control. It's not about the poor people rising up and overthrowing anything. And so that would be why it would be embraced. But Hinduism and Buddhism also don't ask people to give up their previous gods. If you have some nature spirit that you've worshipped before, Hinduism, of course, has hundreds of gods. And so maybe it's just one more god that you worship. And so that's a very easy transition from whatever your faith was before, animistic, to Hinduism. And in Buddhism, of course, Mahayana Buddhism says that, look, you can have your own gods. Maybe your local people were just reincarnations or manifestations of the Buddha. And so both of these faiths make a seamless transition into the religions that were there previously, because they're not asking you to actually change that much of your lifestyle. Your religion can, to some extent, stay the same as you then embrace this new faith. Social impact. Southeast Asia didn't have, as far as we know, any large-scale civilization that promoted writing. And so Southeast Asians, for the most part, did not have their own written system. But as they start to develop kingdoms and they start to see trade go up, there's a need for recording the deeds of kings or recording business transactions. And so, of course, they're going to adapt their writing style from the Hindu merchants that come in and introduce Sanskrit. And so we see the languages of the cultures that live in Southeast Asia today, many of them have a writing system that is very similar to India. because that's who invented this writing system and then brought it in through trade. However, cultural diffusion, as I have said repeatedly, is like a buffet. You take what you like, but you reject what you don't. And let's imagine that you're one of these village leaders that is now a king. You've figured out how to have a kingship, and you've got the army to create one. What don't you take from Hinduism? Well, you like the idea in Hinduism that there is a social structure with people on top and people on the bottom, but what you don't like about Hinduism is that the people on top in Hinduism are the Brahmin priests, and you don't like that because that's not you. You may be a warrior, and they're the second level down. And so we see that the caste system, for this reason, does not kind of transport itself from India to Southeast Asia, because the rulers don't like being second tier, and a lot of the people who are at the bottom of the caste structure, that would be at the bottom of the caste structure in Southeast Asia, don't like it either, because they don't want to have this idea of reincarnation through thousands of lives to move up to another level. And so they take some aspects of Hinduism, but not all the aspects of Hinduism and South Asian culture. So let's continue to talk about social ideas. And so what we see here on the left is a Hindu temple in India. You see it's kind of this deflated football shape for the towers, and there's lots of little steps to it, and there'll be lots of gods on the outside. Typically, this one has worn away, but there'll be lots of colors painted on the outside. And also Buddhist temples will sometimes look like this or have a resemblance to it. And then we see this architecture is transported over into Southeast Asia. And so if we look at these two temples, it's obvious to see that the architecture for these temples started in South Asia and they made their way into Southeast Asia. So here you have this temple in Angkor Wat. And so this is a very easy an example of cultural diffusion because they will adopt and modify to some extent, but for the most part adopt Indian architecture and make it into their own architecture. And so a great example of cultural diffusion, ideas spreading from one region to another through trade. Now let's talk about economics a little bit more. It says that wealthy kingdoms emerge that will dominate choke points of trade between China and India. So if we look on this map, in the middle of the map we see sticking down into the Indian Ocean, India or South Asia. And on the right-hand side of the map we see Japan and China. And right in the middle of this maritime trade network is Southeast Asia, sticking out there as this big peninsula. And then we see circled we see the Straits of Malacca. And that is a choke point of trade. It is the quickest way to get from India to China, and these two large-scale civilizations want to trade goods with each other. And so Southeast Asians will play a critical role, not just being merchants who trade in both the South China Sea and also in the Indian Ocean, but they'll also be involved as middlemen in between these things, making a lot of money. And it's not like you can go anyplace else. You have to go through Southeast Asia, and especially through the Straits of Malacca. And so we see kingdoms start to emerge that will control these choke points and get incredibly wealthy on it. Of course, today we have the tiny nation of Singapore that is this almost like a city-state that is on the very tip of this peninsula at the Straits of Malacca that controls trade back and forth in this region. So we see some continuity from period 3 all the way to today, the importance of location in determining wealth and trade. So now let's go ahead and fast forward to period 3. And in period 3, we've talked a lot about the spread of Islam from Southwest Asia to North Africa and Europe to South Asia, and it's going to get as far as Southeast Asia. And it's the same exact process of what brought Hinduism and Buddhism to Southeast Asia just a period later. And so let's say that there is a kingdom on the coast here that we see circled, and that king had converted to either Hinduism or Buddhism in period 2, and he wants to stay that religion because that gives him trade contacts with India, the Hindus or Buddhists in India. But now let's say that Muslim merchants start to reach the region. And so if I'm the village leader at the bottom of here on the coast, maybe I'm animistic, I haven't converted to either Buddhism or Hinduism yet, and I'm just starting to learn about trade. And so what I'll do is I'll convert to Islam. And I think that if I convert to Islam, the Muslim merchant would rather come and trade with me than the Hindus and Buddhists further north along the coast. And so we see merchants will be some of the first people to convert to Islam in Southeast Asia, and then also maybe kings will convert. The local village leader will, I think, well, if I convert, maybe these Muslim merchants will trade with me, then I can use that trade to build up power. That power I can build up an army with. And so, again, like we see in many places, merchants and political rulers are often the first to convert because it's to their advantage too. They can use that to gain even more power. So here we have talked about the aspect of economic trade increasing the spread of Islam. Also, we've talked about Sufis, and Sufis do come into Southeast Asia. And just like we said in part one of the lecture, local people are inspired to convert, and sometimes these are regular people, not elites and merchants, but just regular common people, peasants, farmers, those kinds of things. And they're inspired to convert to Islam because they see these Sufi mystics come in who they believe have magical healing powers and offer a spirituality in their faith. And so we see that these, if we want to think of them as missionaries for Islam, they certainly come in and spread the faith as well. How does Islam impact the women of the region? Well, prior to period 3, before Islam comes in, Southeast Asian women could own businesses, they could get a divorce, they didn't have to be chaperoned. So when Islam comes in and they adopt Islam, that's great. They adopt the idea of monotheism and a spiritual faith and heaven, but they don't like the idea of women being chaperoned because that's not their society. Their society has given a great deal of freedom and opportunity to women. And this idea of changing that and having women be chaperoned, and we've talked about why that is in Southwest Asia, but chaperoned and not be able to own their own businesses is not something that the Southeast Asians say is part of their culture, and so they reject that. Again, this idea of cultural diffusion being like a buffet. You take what you like and you reject what you don't. And that's the end of our lecture on Islam in Southeast Asia.